The storm rolled across the Atlantic like a dark omen the night young Samuel Briggs opened the old wooden chest in his grandfather's attic. He wasn't looking for treasure, just a piece of the man he'd lost. But inside lay something far more valuable. A bundle of letters, faded, fragile, but filled with a truth powerful enough to rewrite everything he thought he knew about America. One line in particular froze him in place. The world did not simply give America its power. America took it piece by piece, moment by moment when no one else believed it could. Samuel had always wondered how a nation barely born in the late 1700s, a fragile collection of colonies on the edge of a continent, could rise to become the most dominant country on Earth. It's a question that has fascinated historians and puzzled nations for centuries. How did it happen? Was it luck? Destiny? Or was it something more calculated? Now, with his grandfather gone, the last voice of the past had handed him the answer. As he unfolded the first letter, the room seemed to dissolve around him. History began to breathe, whispering the real story, one that would connect every war, every sacrifice, every ambition, and every secret decision that shaped the United States into the superpower it is today. Samuel sank onto the attic floor, the letter trembling in his hands. "Grandfather," he whispered, "tell me how it really happened." And the past replied, "This is the story of America's ascent, not as you learned it in school, but as it was lived, fought for, and seized." We start at the very beginning, with a bold declaration that shocked the world. In the late 18th century, America was an underdog, surrounded by the empires of Britain, France, and Spain. Its survival was anything but certain, but it had something those empires underestimated: a revolutionary idea of liberty and a relentless ambition. The real first step towards global dominance wasn't a battle, but a purchase. In 1803, Napoleon was waging war across Europe and needed cash. He offered America a deal that would change the world: a Louisiana Purchase. For just pennies an acre, the United States doubled its size overnight. This wasn't just buying land. It was buying a future. A vast, resource-rich continent was now open for expansion, fueling a belief in what would be called manifest destiny. The nation's gaze turned westward, but its ambitions were already looking across the oceans. However, before America could project power abroad, it had to define itself at home. The early 19th century was marked by a fierce debate. Should the U.S. isolate itself or engage with the world? The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was the first bold answer. It was a warning shot to Europe. The Americas were no longer open for colonization. This was America drawing a line in the sand, claiming an entire hemisphere as its sphere of influence. A shockingly bold move for such a young country. But the nation's greatest test was yet to come. The Civil War wasn't just a battle over slavery. It was a war for America's very soul, and when the smoke cleared, it left behind a transformed nation. The war accelerated industrialization on an unprecedented scale. Railroads, steel mills, and factories exploded across the North. This industrial might, forged in the fires of conflict, would become the engine of American power. By the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. had surpassed Britain as the world's leading industrial nation. It was producing more steel, more oil, and more innovations than anyone else. But economic power is one thing. Global leadership is another. America was an industrial giant, but a political recluse. That was about to change. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was the turning point. "Remember the Maine" became the rallying cry that launched America onto the world stage. Victory was swift. And suddenly, the U.S. had an overseas empire, with territories from the Caribbean to the Pacific. It was a controversial leap, but there was no turning back. America had tasted global power, and the 20th century would see its appetite grow. When World War I erupted, America initially stayed out, but by 1917, it could no longer remain on the sidelines. American industry and manpower tipped the scales, securing an Allied victory. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris with a vision for a new world order. But the world, and even America itself, wasn't quite ready for it. The nation retreated back into isolationism, but the seeds of global leadership had been planted. The true moment of ascension came from the ashes of World War II. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, America stood untouched, its factories booming. It emerged from the war not just as a victor, but as the world's sole economic and military superpower, possessing the atomic bomb, the post-war era, the Marshall Plan, the creation of Nettoless, was America not just reacting to history, but actively writing it. It built a new world order, with itself at the center. The Cold War that followed was a 40-year chess match against the Soviet Union, a battle of ideologies that played out across the globe, from the Korean Peninsula to the jungles of Vietnam, and even to the moon itself. Every move, every alliance, every crisis was a test of this new power. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no question left. America stood alone, the undisputed global hegemon, from a fragile republic to a global empire. The journey was driven by a relentless mix of idealism, ambition, and ruthless pragmatism. It's a story of taking chances when no one else would, of building, innovating, and sometimes of fighting to shape the world in its own image. This is the story Samuel Briggs discovered in that attic unwritten history of how a nation willed itself into greatness. What do you think was the single most important moment in America's rise to power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. My grandfather, Thomas Briggs, was a quiet man, gentle, observant, and fiercely proud of his country. I thought I knew him, but after he passed, I found a box of his old letters in the attic. And in those letters, I discovered a different story of America. Not the one from the textbooks, but a raw, unflinching look at how a fragile idea became the most powerful nation on earth. His writings revealed a truth I'd never considered. America's rise wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't inevitable. It was earned, forged in blood, fueled by ambition, and built on a series of impossible choices. The story, as my grandfather wrote it, begins in 1776, but it doesn't start with a glorious victory. It starts with pure, unadulterated desperation. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry, and the newly formed United States was on the verge of collapse. It was weak, outmanned, critically underfunded, and the 13 colonies were hardly united. They were a patchwork of competing interests, held together by a thread. But my grandfather explained that within the people, something burned far hotter than any British cannon. It was a radical, almost reckless belief in possibility. Imagine being an ordinary farmer, a schoolteacher, or a merchant back then. You have a family, a home, a life, and you risk it all, everything for a dream. A dream of a country that didn't even exist yet. A dream you weren't sure would survive the coming winter. That fire, that unwavering conviction that the world could be fundamentally reinvented, became the true foundation of American power. As I read his words, the dusty attic around me started to fade away. I could almost see it. Ragged, half-starved soldiers crossing the frozen Delaware River, their feet wrapped in cloths. I could picture women melting down their last pewter plates to forge bullets when the metals ran out. I saw enslaved people risking everything to escape into continental lines, holding on to the desperate hope that this revolution's promise of freedom would finally, truly apply to them. America's first strength, my grandfather wrote, wasn't its government, its treasury, or its army. It was the stubborn, audacious willingness of its people to become something greater than themselves. Then, time in the letters rushes forward. The narrative leaps into the 19th century, and the Industrial Revolution roars to life across the young nation. Factories rose from the ground like steel giants, their smokestacks piercing the sky. Railroads, like iron veins, began stitching the vast and divided states together, connecting east to west, city to frontier. And with this new age of iron and steam came new people. Immigrants arrived in waves, their ships filling the harbors of New York, Boston, and San Francisco. They were Irish, fleeing famine. Germans, escaping political turmoil. Italians, seeking economic opportunity. Chinese, dreaming of gold mountains. Each person, each family, carried their own stories of hunger, war, and persecution. But they all shared one thing: hope. They didn't just arrive in America. They built Italiano. They laid the tracks, mined the coal, worked the factories, and farmed the land. They brought their cultures, their foods, their languages, and their relentless drive. My grandfather was clear on this point. America did not become powerful despite these immigrants. It became powerful precisely because of them. Their sweat, their determination, their dreams. It was all woven into the very fabric of the nation's identity. They were the engine of its growth. But as I continued reading, the tone of the letters shifted. "Every great rise," he wrote, "casts a long and dark shadow." My chest tightened as I got to the chapters on the Civil War. He described it not as a distant historical event, but as a deep, soul-tearing wound. Brother against brother, a nation literally tearing itself apart over the fundamental meaning of liberty and the brutal hypocrisy of slavery. The sheer scale of the bloodshed, the bitterness of the division, it should have been the end. It should have shattered the American experiment into a million irreparable pieces. But it didn't. And this, my grandfather argued, is where America discovered its second great source of power: resilience. From the ashes of that horrific conflict, a broken nation somehow, painstakingly, stitched itself back together. It was a messy, painful, and deeply imperfect process. But the Union was preserved, and in the aftermath, the country didn't just recover. It surged forward with a new, hardened determination. The factories roared even louder. Cities climbed higher, their skylines transforming with every passing year. And the American frontier, that symbolic line between civilization and the unknown, was pushed relentlessly westward until it finally touched the Pacific Ocean. The age of cowboys and homesteaders was also the age of steel magnates and inventors. By the early 1900s, the United States wasn't just a regional power anymore. It was an industrial behemoth, a sleeping giant of innovation and production. It was still finding its footing, still wrestling with its own identity and its internal contradictions. But it was growing, preparing itself, almost unconsciously, to step onto the world stage. And soon, the world would be in desperate need of a new kind of power. The old empires of Europe were about to plunge into a catastrophic war, and when the world cried out, America would answer. But as I got to the end of this section of letters, I could feel my grandfather leading me somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. He was building an argument, piece by piece. He was guiding me through the nation's triumphs and its tragedies for a reason. The real turning point, he hinted, was not the revolution. It wasn't the industrial boom or even the crucible of the Civil War. The true, definitive reason America became the global superpower we know today was still to come. It was a secret, he wrote, that was waiting for me in the next chapter of his story, a secret buried in the rubble and ruins of a world that was about to shatter itself to pieces. He was talking about the world wars. And I knew, turning the page, that the story of America and the world was about to change. Forever. The second letter opened with an explosion not on a battlefield, but in the global order itself. It was April 1917, and the world was drowning in the chaos of World War I for 3 long years. Europe had been tearing itself apart, a gruesome spectacle of empires clashing, trenches filling with mud and blood, and an entire generation of young men vanishing into the meat grinder. Until then, America had stood apart, watching from across the Atlantic. Europe was the old world, its conflicts were ancient, its rivalries deep-seated. America was the new world, a nation built on the idea of leaving all that behind. But as Samuel continued to read his grandfather's words, he learned the truth. America didn't rush into the war out of some simple sense of duty or a thirst for glory. It entered because the world, as everyone knew it, was collapsing, and someone had to step in to rebuild it from the ashes. The moment the United States officially joined the conflict, everything shifted. It was like a colossal weight had been dropped on one side of a scale. Suddenly, American soldiers, the famous doughboys, began to cross the ocean. These weren't professional warriors. They were young men from farms in Iowa, from the roaring cities of New York and Chicago, from the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the factories of Detroit. They were ordinary people who had likely never imagined they would one day fight on foreign soil, in fields and forests whose names they couldn't even pronounce. They didn't just bring fresh manpower to the exhausted Allied lines. They brought something far more powerful: hope. To the French and British soldiers who had been fighting for years, who had seen their friends and brothers fall beside them. The sight of these energetic, determined Americans was a sign that the tide was finally turning. They were a promise that this nightmare of a war might actually have an end. But my grandfather, Thomas, explained that the real transformation, the one that truly cemented America's future, wasn't happening in the trenches. It was happening far from the front lines and banks, on shipping docks, and inside factories. While European industry was being bombed into rubble, American industries went into overdrive. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, shipyards in Philadelphia, and munitions factories all across the country began working around the clock. They were fueling the Allied armies, producing everything from bullets and artillery shells to uniforms and food. It was an industrial miracle. At the same time, American loans were keeping entire nations afloat. Countries like Great Britain and France, once the wealthiest empires on earth, were on the brink of bankruptcy. They were borrowing unimaginable sums of money from the United States just to continue the fight. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, the world map of power had been redrawn. Europe, which for centuries had been the undisputed center of global finance, culture, and military might, now owed its very survival to the United States. A chill ran down Samuel's spine. This was it. This was the turning point his grandfather had hinted at. America became a superpower not by conquering the world, but by becoming its financial and industrial backbone. World War II, just 2 decades later, only solidified this new reality. The second global conflict was even more devastating than the first. While Europe and Asia burned, while cities like London, Warsaw, and Tokyo were reduced to smoldering ruins, the American homeland remained virtually untouched. Protected by 2 vast oceans, its factories didn't just survive. They grew stronger, bigger, and more efficient than ever before. This was the era of the arsenal of democracy. American shipyards were producing ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. American assembly lines churned out tens of thousands of planes, tanks, and jeeps, arming not just their own soldiers, but the armies of all their allies. From the British in North Africa to the Soviets on the Eastern Front, it was a mobilization of people and industry on a scale the world had never witnessed. Beyond the factories, America's scientists were pushing the boundaries of what was possible, culminating in the secret Manhattan Project, which would forever change the nature of warfare and global power. And perhaps most importantly, its people united in a way few nations ever have. The war effort erased many of the lines that divided them. Men and women, black and white, immigrants and native-born citizens, all came together with a common purpose. They planted victory gardens, bought war bonds, and worked tirelessly for the cause. By 1945, when the smoke finally cleared from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the old world was in ruins. Empires had crumbled, entire economies were shattered. Amidst the wreckage, only one nation stood tall enough, strong enough, and wealthy enough to lead the effort to rebuild the world and, in doing so, define the future for generations to come. As Samuel reached the final pages, his grandfather's words grew softer, more reflective. Power, Thomas wrote, is not something that is simply given to you, my boy. It is not a birthright or a matter of destiny. It is earned. It is earned through sacrifice, through leadership, and through the incredible courage to step forward when everyone else is stepping back. America became a superpower because when the world fell into darkness, not once, but twice, it chose to become a light. It chose to build, not just to destroy. It chose to offer a hand, not just a fist. Samuel carefully closed the last letter. Tears glimmered in his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of a profound and sudden understanding. He realized his grandfather hadn't just given him a history lesson, a dry story about a nation's rise to prominence. He had given him a story about people, millions of ordinary people who, through their combined struggle, their shared hope, and their impossible determination, built something extraordinary. The attic, which had felt so cold and desolate before, now felt warm, filled with the presence of generations past. Outside, the storm had finally passed, and the first rays of morning sun were breaking through the clouds. Samuel placed the letters gently back into their wooden chest and whispered into the quiet room. I understand, grandfather. I understand the real reason, the real truth. He stood up, no longer just a young man sorting through old memories, but a keeper of a legacy. He felt a new sense of purpose, a responsibility to carry this story forward, because this was a story the world deserved to know. The real story of how America truly became a superpower, not through some predetermined destiny or by simple military conquest, but through the quiet, unbreakable courage of its people. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, Please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.